The morning my husband told me I was no longer welcome at his firm's annual gala, I said, "Of course. Whatever you think is best." He straightened his cufflinks in the mirror and nodded, satisfied. That was the thing about my husband, he mistook my silence for surrender. He always had. His name was Richard. Dr. Richard Calloway. Cardiothoracic surgeon. The kind of man who walked into rooms and watched them rearrange themselves around him. I had married him 11 years ago in a garden ceremony in Savannah, where the wisteria was blooming and my mother cried happy tears and his mother assessed my dress with the quiet efficiency of an appraiser. My name is Elena. I was 32 when he told me I was an embarrassment. I was 33 by the time he understood what that word actually cost him. For the first 6 years of our marriage, I was what Richard needed me to be. Gracious at dinner parties, understated at hospital fundraisers. I learned which wines his colleagues preferred, which topics made the chief of surgery laugh, how to redirect a conversation when Richard's ego needed a soft landing. I had a graduate degree in architectural design that I stopped using 2 years after the wedding because Richard said it was better if I focused on the home, on us, on building the life he was working so hard to provide. I focused. I built. I disappeared into it so gradually that I didn't notice I was gone. The shift happened slowly, the way most erosions do, not with a crack but with years of quiet pressure. A comment about my laugh being too loud at a department dinner. A suggestion that I let him handle the conversation with his colleagues because I didn't quite understand the context. The first time he used the word embarrassing, we were in the car on the way home from a charity auction. I had bid on a weekend getaway package because the auctioneer was charming and the room was warm and it seemed like the kind of spontaneous thing people at charity auctions do. Richard did not speak to me for 2 days. By the time he told me I wasn't welcome at the gala, the word embarrassing had been used 11 times. I know because I had started counting. I kept a small journal, pale blue, the size of a paperback, in the inside pocket of my winter coat, which hung in the hall closet where Richard never looked. I wrote down dates, words, the texture of moments I knew I would someday need to remember with precision. The gala was the annual benefit for Calloway Heart Cardiac Institute. Richard had his name on the building. His name was also, as I had discovered 4 months earlier, in a thread of text messages from a woman named Diana Holt, a pharmaceutical sales representative who had been attending his Tuesday afternoon advisory meetings for the better part of a year. I had found the messages by accident. His phone had buzzed on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower, and I had glanced over out of nothing more than reflex. Can't stop thinking about last Tuesday. That was all I needed to read. I put the phone back exactly where it was. I finished making coffee. When Richard came downstairs, I handed him his cup and asked about his schedule, and he told me about a procedure he had at 7, and I nodded. And the morning continued as mornings do when one person at the table is performing normalcy and the other doesn't notice the performance. That night, after he fell asleep, I opened my pale blue journal and wrote the date. I did not cry. I had already done my grieving months before that moment, slow, private, the kind that happens in the shower or on long drives with the radio off. What I felt sitting at our kitchen table at 11:43 at night was not grief. It was something colder and more useful. It was clarity. I called my college roommate, Priya, the next morning from my car, in the parking lot of the grocery store. Priya was a family law attorney in Atlanta. We had stayed close in the way that real friendships survive distance, not by talking every week but by being the person you call when something actually matters. "Tell me everything," she said, "and don't leave anything out." I told her about the texts, about the 11 times, about the journal, about the architectural degree sitting in a drawer, about the money because there was a great deal of money and Richard had always managed it, and I had let him because he said it was more efficient that way, and efficiency had been one of my many quiet surrenders. Priya was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said, "Elena, how long have you been keeping that journal?" "About 2 years," I said. Another pause. "Good," she said. "Don't stop." What followed was not an explosion. It was an education. Priya connected me with a forensic accountant named Marcus Webb, a soft-spoken man in his 50s who wore bow ties and spoke about financial documentation with the reverence of someone discussing sacred texts. I met with Marcus on Thursday mornings at a coffee shop near my gym, which gave me a plausible reason to leave the house at the right time. Over 7 weeks, Marcus walked me through 11 years of joint finances with the patience of a man who had done this before and understood that the information was not abstract, it was the record of a life. What he found was instructive. Richard had a secondary account I hadn't known about, opened 3 years into our marriage. The deposits were irregular but consistent. Marcus explained, without editorializing, what patterns like that typically indicated. I wrote it all down. I also called my mother. She lived in Charleston, in the house I had grown up in, and she had opinions about Richard that she had kept to herself for 11 years with a discipline I had always respected and now understood was a form of love. When I told her what was happening, she was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. "Tell me what you need," she said. "Nothing yet," I said. "But I'll call you when I do." "I'll be ready," she said. The gala was on a Saturday in October. Richard told me on a Tuesday that I would not be attending. He framed it as consideration. "You've seemed tired lately. It'll be a long evening, these things drain you." And when I looked at him and said, "Of course. Whatever you think is best," he visibly relaxed. He believed that sentence. He had been believing versions of it for 11 years. What he did not know was that I had already called our accountant, our joint accountant, a man named Gerald, who had quietly informed me, when I asked the right questions the previous Thursday, that certain things in our financial structure were time-sensitive, and that I might want to be aware of specific documents before a quarterly review window closed. Gerald was not disloyal to Richard. He was simply responsive to direct questions from a joint account holder, and I had asked direct questions for the first time. The Saturday of the gala, Richard dressed in his study. He had moved his things there 3 weeks earlier, following an argument about the guest list for his mother's birthday dinner, an argument in which he told me that my inability to stay in my lane was becoming a pattern he was losing patience with. I had nodded. I had gone to the guest room. I had lain in the dark and thought about lane markers and who gets to draw them. He left at 6:15. I watched from the upstairs window as the car service took him down the driveway. Then I changed out of my robe, put on the gray blazer I had bought specifically for this day, and drove to meet Priya at her office. We worked until midnight. The following Monday, Richard came to breakfast in a good mood. The gala had apparently gone well. Diana had been there. I knew this not because he told me, but because I had seen a photograph posted to the Hospital Foundation's social media that morning. Richard in his tuxedo, Diana in a green dress, standing at what appeared to be a very comfortable distance from each other for two people who were supposed to be professionally acquainted. He poured his coffee and talked about the pledge total and mentioned that the chief of surgery had given a moving speech. I asked appropriate questions. I refilled his cup. When he left for the hospital at 7, I sat for a moment at the kitchen table and looked at the room I had decorated and maintained and moved through for a decade, and I thought, this is the last ordinary morning. 3 weeks later, I filed. Richard's attorney called Priya within 2 hours. I was at my mother's house in Charleston by then, sitting on the back porch with a cup of tea, watching her garden. She had driven up that morning and met me halfway. When my phone buzzed and I saw his name, I let it go to voicemail. He left a message that lasted 4 minutes. I listened to it once, noted the date and time in my journal, and did not call back. The discovery process was where things became specific. Richard's attorney was aggressive in a way that Priya described as predictable. He argued that my contributions to the marriage were limited and that Richard's earning power was the product of his individual talent and effort, unrelated to the domestic infrastructure I had maintained, the social calendar I had managed, the career I had set aside. He used the word lifestyle to describe what I had been provided. I had a forensic accountant, 2 years of journal entries, a screenshot from a phone I had photographed on the kitchen counter at 6:42 in the morning before the coffee was done, and a record of 11 years of financial decisions that Marcus had documented with the thoroughness of someone who understood that details are everything. I also had Diana, not as an adversary, as evidence, because Diana, as it turned out, had been receiving what Richard's financial records described as consulting fees from a subsidiary account for 14 months. Marcus had found it during week 3 of our Thursday sessions, and he had set the relevant documents in front of me without comment and waited while I read them. I looked up. "How much?" I said. He told me. I wrote it down. Diana was not called as a witness. Her involvement was surfaced through documentation alone, the kind that Richard had not imagined would be found because he had not imagined I would look. His attorney's aggression quieted in the second week of mediation when Priya laid the financial summary on the table. The mediator, a woman named Dr. Patricia Ames, had been doing this for 23 years. She did not react to the documents. She simply reviewed them, organized them with the care of someone who had seen worse and known how to proceed, and moved forward. Richard sat across from me for the first time in 6 weeks. He was wearing the charcoal suit he wore to important meetings. He looked at the documents and then he looked at me, and I recognized the expression because I had seen it once before at the charity auction, in the car on the way home. But this time there was something underneath it that hadn't been there before. I looked back at him without looking away. I did not feel triumphant. I felt, with a steadiness that surprised me, like myself. The settlement took 11 days to finalize. I received my half of our shared assets, which were more substantial than Richard's lifestyle arguments had implied. I received a structured settlement that accounted for the years of career interruption and the documented value of the professional support I had provided. I received the car, which was in my name and had been since purchase, a detail Richard had apparently forgotten. I received a sum from the personal account Marcus had found, which Richard's attorney attempted to reclassify 3 times before running out of reclassifications. I did not ask for the house. I had no desire to live in a space that had been slowly edited down to his preferences. I let him have it, and I watched his expression change when he realized that what he'd expected to be leverage was something I had already released. Priya shook my hand in the parking lot outside Dr. Ames's office and then pulled me into a hug that lasted long enough to mean something. "You were meticulous," she said. "I had a good teacher," I said. My mother was waiting at the house in Charleston when I arrived that evening. She had made the lamb stew she always made when she wanted to say something words couldn't carry, and she set the bowl in front of me and sat down across from me and didn't try to fill the quiet with anything. I was 33 years old, and I was starting again, and the thing I noticed most in the weeks that followed was not the absence of Richard but the presence of space room for my own thoughts, my own schedule, my own version of ordinary mornings. I found a small studio in a neighborhood I had always liked and never lived in. I called the graduate department of the architecture school I had left 11 years ago and asked about returning. The coordinator, a young man who sounded genuinely interested, said the portfolio I had submitted when I was admitted was still on file. He asked if I could come in to discuss options. I said yes. I bought a pale blue journal, a new one, and on the first page I did not write a date or a name or a document reference. I wrote a single line that I had been carrying since the mediation, something Dr. Patricia Ames had said while gathering her folders, almost to herself, as we were leaving the room. The quietest people in a room are usually the ones who've already made their decision. Richard called twice in November. I let both calls go to voicemail. His messages were shorter than the first one, less anger, more something I recognized as the particular bewilderment of a person encountering consequences they did not calculate because they did not believe consequences applied to them. I did not call back. I had nothing left to explain. What I want you to understand. If you have ever sat at a kitchen table at midnight running the math on your own silence, what I want you to know is that the 11 times were not the beginning of the end. They were the end of a beginning I had already survived. The math was never about him. It was about how long I had believed that shrinking was the same thing as keeping the peace, that disappearing was the same as being good, that a voice set aside carefully enough would still be there when you needed it. Mine was. That's the part he never anticipated. He thought the guest room was a punishment. I knew, the moment I walked in and sat down on that narrow bed in the dark, that it was the first room I had had entirely to myself in 11 years. By the time he came home the next evening expecting an apology, I had already made 3 phone calls that would quietly change everything. He stood in the doorway and looked at me and said, with that particular tone he used when he was offering me a way to make things easier, "Are we going to resolve this?" I looked up from the book I was reading. "Yes," I said. "We are." He took that as agreement. He always took my sentences the way he needed to take them. The resolution just didn't look like what he expected. And I think, if I am honest, that was always true. The woman he thought he had married, quiet, careful, efficient in her disappearing, she had been practicing something the whole time. Not patience, exactly. Not tolerance. Something closer to what my mother would call readiness. The understanding that there is a difference between the moment something ends and the moment you decide it's over, and that the distance between those 2 moments, if you are paying attention, is where everything useful happens. I paid attention. I was ready. And when the moment came, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to.